Obscura Libri. The rain in Manhattan didn't just fall, it conquered. It turned the sky into a sheet of slate and the asphalt into a dark mirror that reflected the neon chaos of Times Square in jagged, bleeding colors. Elara pressed her forehead against the cool, vibration-prone glass of the M15 bus. Her breath fogged the window, creating a small, private veil between her and the city she no longer recognized. New York had felt hollow since her grandmother, Evelyn, had passed 3 weeks ago. Evelyn had been a woman of sharp edges and soft wool, a collector of unfortunate histories, who lived in a rent-controlled apartment overflowing with clocks that never quite ticked in unison. Her final moments hadn't been peaceful. She had gripped Elara's wrist with a strength born of pure terror, her eyes wide and clouded by cataracts. The answers are in the books, on the corner. Then, the grip had gone slack. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elara had ever heard. Now, Elara pulled her damp wool scarf tighter around her neck. She had spent 21 days chasing a ghost. She'd visited every corner bookstore, from the Battery to Inwood. She'd browsed pristine boutiques in the West Village and dusty basements in the Upper East Side. Nothing. The bus lurched to a halt at a stop she usually ignored, a liminal space between the glitz of Midtown and the industrial grid of the flickering tunnels. Elara felt a sudden, sharp tug in her chest, like a fishhook caught in her sternum. She scrambled off the bus just as the doors hissed shut, her boots splashing into a deep puddle. She stood on the corner of 47th and a street that didn't seem to have a sign. To her left was a popular burger joint screaming in yellow and red. To her right, a glass and steel monolith that housed a hedge fund. But tucked between them, squeezed into a space that shouldn't have been wider than an alleyway, was a facade of dark, weathered wood. The sign swung on rusted chains, groaning against the wind, Obscura Libri. Elara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked this route every day to her job at the archives. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every graffiti tag. This shop was not here yesterday. It hadn't been here an hour ago. The air around the door felt heavy, charged with the static density that precedes a lightning strike. When she pushed the heavy oak door, the scream of the city, the sirens, the shouting, the thrum of engines, was instantly severed. The librarian of shadows. The interior of Obscura Libri defied the laws of Manhattan real estate. Outside, it looked 10 feet wide. Inside, the ceiling disappeared into a cathedral-like gloom. Shelves didn't just line the walls, they grew like redwood trees, branching off into mezzanine levels connected by spiral staircases that groaned under the weight of 1 billion pages. The air tasted of ancient dust and a sharp, metallic tang, like a copper penny on the tongue, underneath a heavy layer of cinnamon. "I don't have much call for the living today," a voice rasped. Elara jumped, her bag slipping from her shoulder. Behind a counter made of petrified wood sat a woman who looked like she was carved from the same material. Her skin was a map of deep-set wrinkles, and her eyes were 2 polished spheres of obsidian, reflecting the single, flickering gas lamp that hung above her. I'm looking for something specific," Elara stammered. "My grandmother sent me." Evelyn Thorne. The old woman's hand, gnarled and spotted with age, paused over a ledger. She looked up, her gaze piercing through Elara's skin, searching for something in her marrow. "Evelyn," the woman whispered. The name sounded like a secret. She was always a bit too fond of the linear. She thought she could outrun the ink. The woman stood, her joints popping like dry kindling. "Destiny has a funny way of guiding us back to the places we tried to burn down. Follow me, child. And do not touch the bindings. Some of them still have teeth." They moved into the labyrinth. Elara felt the shop shifting behind them. When she glanced back, the door was gone, replaced by a wall of scrolls bound in human hair. The silence here was predatory. The old woman stopped at a section tucked into a dark cul-de-sac. The gold lettering on the shelves had faded to a ghostly shimmer, Temporalia. "Your grandmother spent 40 years trying to find the ending to her story," the woman said, reaching toward a shelf that seemed to be vibrating. She pulled out a volume bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb the light of the gas lamp. It had no title. No author. She failed because she forgot that in this shop, you don't read the books. They read you. She pressed the book into Alara's hands. It was startlingly heavy, and the leather felt warm, feverish. This is the key, the old woman warned, her voice dropping to a gravelly hiss. But be warned. Time is a river, and we are but silt. If you stir the bottom, the water stays muddy forever. Tampering with the currents has unforeseen consequences. The shimmer. As Alara's fingers curled around the spine, the world began to tilt. The gas lamp didn't just flicker, it exploded into a sun-bright glare. The sound of the rain outside died instantly, replaced by a high-pitched hum that vibrated in Alara's teeth. The shelves began to blur, the books stretching into long ribbons of brown and gold. Wait! Alara cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the hum. The old woman was fading, her obsidian eyes the last thing to vanish. Find the truth, Alara. Fulfill your destiny. Or don't. The ending is written, regardless of whether you've reached the page. The floor beneath Alara's boots vanished. She felt a sensation of falling, not through space, but through memory. She saw flashes of her grandmother as a young woman, standing in this very shop. She saw her father, a man she never knew, holding the same dark book. Then, the pressure vanished. The humming stopped with a deafening finality. Alara collapsed to her knees, clutching the book to her chest. The air was different, thinner, smelling of ozone and sterile burnt sugar. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking. The bookstore was still there, but it had been scrubbed clean. The dust was gone. A hovering orb of soft, blue light had replaced the gas lamp. The Temperalia sign was now a holographic projection pulsing in the air. Alara stumbled toward the window. The New York she knew was a relic. Outside, the sky was a deep, artificial violet. Buildings of white carbon fiber spiraled miles into the air, connected by translucent tubes. Sleek, silent vehicles zipped through the air in synchronized streams. There was no rain. There was no noise. She looked down at the book. On the dark leather cover, words were now beginning to bleed into existence, as if written by an invisible hand. The Chronicle of the Architect, Volume 3. The truth in the ink. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She fumbled with the latch of the book. It didn't open like a normal book. The pages felt like sheets of glass, cool and humming with power. She turned to the first page. It wasn't a story. It was a log. Iteration 4502. Subject, Thorne, Evelyn. Result, failure. Subject failed to bridge the 21st century gap. Emotional attachment to the linear timeline remains the primary obstacle. Alara's breath hitched. She flipped the pages, her heart racing. Iteration 4503. Subject, Thorne, Alara. Status, commenced. She looked around the shop. The old woman was nowhere to be seen, but a door at the back of the store hissed open. A man stepped out. He wore a lab coat of the same shimmering material as the buildings outside. He looked at a tablet in his hand, then up at Alara. He didn't look surprised. He looked bored. "Ah, you're early," he said, tapping his screen. The transition usually takes a bit more out of the subjects. "How's the vestibular recovery? Any nausea? Who are you?" Alara backed away, hitting a shelf. "Where is my grandmother? What did you do to New York?" The man sighed, walking toward the counter. "New York? Oh, you mean the simulation site. It's still there, technically. Just a few terabytes of data running on a loop in the basement. Your grandmother was a senior technician who got a bit too immersed in her role. She thought she could save the people in the program. She even tried to smuggle one out." He gestured to Alara. "She tried to smuggle me?" Alara whispered. "She tried to make you real," the man corrected. "She stole a physical vessel, that body you're wearing, and uploaded a subroutine of her own consciousness into it. She called it Alara. We've been trying to retrieve the hardware for weeks. That's why we left the Obscura backdoor open on the corner. We knew the grandmother protocol would leave you a crumb trail. He reached out his hand. Give me the book, Alara. It's not a key. It's the external hard drive containing the rest of your personality matrix. We need to wipe it and reset the site. The twist. Alara looked from the man to the book. She felt the warmth of it, the feverish heat she had mistaken for life. She looked at her hands. They looked real. They felt real. She remembered the smell of the rain and the taste of the cinnamon in the shop. I'm not a program, she said, her voice trembling. I feel. I remember her. I remember the way she smelled like lavender and old paper. Of course you do, the man said kindly, as if speaking to a child. Lavender.exe is a classic. Very evocative. But look at the book again, Alara. Look at the last page. Alara flipped to the very back. The last page wasn't glass. It was a mirror. But it didn't reflect the high-tech shop. It didn't reflect the man in the lab coat. It reflected a small, cramped apartment in 1994. It reflected a young woman, Evelyn, sitting at a desk, frantically writing in a dark leather journal. In the mirror, Evelyn looked up, her eyes wide with terror, staring directly at Alara. Run, the Evelyn in the mirror mouthed. Alara realized with a jolt of horror that the man in the lab coat wasn't the creator. The high-tech world outside wasn't the real world. She looked at the man again. His image flickered. For a split second, his lab coat turned into a tattered robe, and his face became the obsidian-eyed woman from the bookstore. The answers aren't in the future, the voice echoed, both the man's and the old woman's at once. They are in the loop. Alara slammed the book shut. The high-tech world began to peel away like wet wallpaper. Underneath the sleek white towers were the familiar, grimy bricks of the 21st century. But underneath the bricks were the cobblestones of the 19th. And underneath that, nothing but ink and white space. She wasn't in the future. She wasn't in a simulation. She was in a draft. Her grandmother hadn't been a technician or a resident of the past. She had been the author. And she had died before she could finish the chapter. Alara looked at the man, the editor, who was reaching for the book to delete the failed character of the granddaughter. I'm not a subroutine, Alara said, clutching the book. She grabbed a pen from the counter, a heavy, fountain pen that felt like a weapon. I'm a protagonist. As the editor lunged, Alara didn't run for the door. She opened the book to the blank page at the end, pressed the nib of the pen to the glass, and began to write her own exit. The bookstore dissolved into a whirlwind of letters and punctuation. The rain returned, but this time, it didn't taste like water. It tasted like ink. The ending. The M15 bus pulled up to the corner of 47th Street. A young woman stepped off, shivering against the December chill. She adjusted her scarf and looked at the space between the Burger King and the office building. There was nothing there but a narrow, empty alleyway filled with trash. She reached into her bag and felt the weight of a leather-bound book. She smiled, a secret, sharp expression. She walked past the alleyway, heading toward a park. She sat on a bench, opened the book, and began to read. The pages told the story of a girl named Alara who had discovered she was a character and escaped her creator. She turned the page, expecting to see the next chapter. Instead, she saw a single sentence at the top of the next page. And then, the reader closed the book. In the park, the woman froze. She looked up, squinting at the sky. Above the clouds, beyond the atmosphere, she felt the weight of a giant hand hovering over the world, ready to shut the cover. She gripped the bench, her existence flickering. Not yet, she whispered to the empty air. I'm still reading. To truly understand the trap Alara had inherited, she had to understand the woman who had built the cage. As the sky above the park began to turn the color of a fading bruise, the literal color of ink drying on a page, Alara retreated from the open air. The sensation of being watched was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical weight, like a spotlight tracking her every move. She found refuge in a 24-hour diner, a place of grease and harsh fluorescent light that felt stubbornly, defiantly, real. She sat in a vinyl booth and opened the book again. This time, she didn't look for her own name. She looked for the margins. She looked for the notes left by the woman who had birthed her. The journals of the architect. The middle of the book was no longer a story, it had transformed into a frantic collage of Evelyn's handwriting. The elegant script Alara remembered from birthday cards had devolved over the years into a jagged, desperate scrawl. Entry, October 12th. The editor is getting closer. I can hear the scratching of the red pen against the sky at night. They think the Alara arc is a plot hole. They want to trim the fat. They don't understand that she is the only part of this narrative that breathes. I have hidden the ink in the cinnamon. I have hidden the truth on the corner of a street that only exists when you aren't looking for it. Alara traced the words. The cinnamon scent in the shop, it wasn't a spice. It was the chemical composition of the ink that made up her world's atmosphere. Entry, November 3rd. I've done it. I've reached the Temporalia section of the Great Library. It isn't a place, it's a timestamp. I've realized that I am not the author. I was just the previous protagonist. I was the Alara of the last draft. I grew old because the author got bored with my youth. I have to give the new Alara something I didn't have, the pen. Alara looked at the fountain pen she had snatched from the counter. It was heavy, made of a material that felt colder than ice. On its barrel, engraved in microscopic letters, were the words, "Scribe of the Void." Suddenly, the diner's bell chimed. The man in the lab coat, the editor, wasn't there. Instead, it was the old woman from the shop. But she wasn't walking, she was gliding, her feet not quite touching the linoleum. Behind her, the other patrons of the diner began to blur. The waitress pouring coffee became a smudge of beige and white. The man eating eggs turned into a gray smear. "You're making a mess of the prose, Alara," the old woman said. Her voice didn't come from her mouth, it resonated directly inside Alara's skull. The architect, your grandmother, was a sentimental fool. She thought a character could possess agency. But look at you. You're shivering. Is that a choice, or is it just how you were written to react to fear? I'm real enough to steal this, Alara said, holding up the pen. The old woman laughed, a sound like dry parchment tearing. The pen? That's not a weapon, child. It's a correction tool. You think you're writing your own escape. You're just providing the author with a more interesting climax before they hit delete on the entire chapter. The void between lines. Alara realized then that she couldn't outrun the story by staying inside it. If she stayed in New York, she was subject to the setting. If she went to the future, she was subject to the genre. She stood up on the diner table, ignored the blurring world around her, and held the pen aloft. If I'm just ink, Alara shouted at the ceiling, then I'm the one who decides where the blot goes. She didn't write a new door. She didn't write a getaway car. She turned the pen on the book itself. She began to cross out the words. She struck through the descriptions of the diner. She slashed lines through the editor. She even began to ink over her own description, the brown hair, the scarf, the December chill. "What are you doing?" the old woman shrieked, her form flickering as the ink covered her description in the book. "You'll erase everything. There will be nothing left." "Exactly," Alara grunted. The world began to dissolve into white. The smell of grease and coffee vanished. The roar of New York fell silent. There was no floor, no sky, no air. There was only Alara and the book, floating in a vast, empty whiteness, the white space of the unwritten page. The editor was gone. The shop was gone. Alara stood in the void, a smudge of ink in a sea of nothingness. She was no longer a girl in a scarf. She was a consciousness. She opened the book to the very first page. The very first line her grandmother had ever written. Rain lashed against the window of the bus, blurring the already indistinct cityscape. Elara took the pen. She didn't erase it. She didn't change the weather. She added a single word to the beginning of the sentence. Our rain lashed against the window. The final twist. The sensation of the bus returned. The vibration of the engine. The cool glass against her forehead. Elara opened her eyes. She was back on the M15. The rain was still there. New York was still there. But when she looked at the person sitting in the seat next to her, she didn't see a stranger. She saw an old woman with eyes like polished obsidian. The woman wasn't a monster or an editor. She was crying. Did we do it? The woman whispered. Elara looked down at her hands. They weren't ink. They were flesh. But when she looked at the window, she didn't see her reflection. She saw the reflection of a hand, a massive, human hand, holding a pen, hovering over the roof of the bus. Elara reached out and touched the old woman's hand. We didn't escape the book, Grandma, Elara whispered. The old woman looked at her, confused. Then where are we? Elara looked up at the sky, where the tip of a giant fountain pen was descending toward them, ready to write the next word. We're in the sequel, Elara said. And as the pen touched the clouds, the world didn't end. It became more vivid. The colors deepened. The rain began to glow. The twist wasn't that Elara was a character. The twist was that the author wasn't a god, the author was a fan. And they weren't trying to delete her. They were trying to keep the story going forever. Elara gripped her grandmother's hand as the bus turned the corner. Let's see what they write next, she said. On the cover of the book, now resting on a desk in a world far above their own, the title began to change. Obscura Libri, the characters who knew. Beyond the ink, beyond the white space and the violet skies of the simulation, there was a room that smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Arthur Penhaligon sat in a chair that creaked with every shift of his weight. He was not a god, though he held the power of one. He was a man in a cramped apartment in a city called London, which looked remarkably like the New York he had built for Elara, just a little more tired, a little more lived in. He stared at his monitor, his eyes bloodshot. The cursor on the screen blinked like a digital heartbeat. Let's see what they write next, she said. Arthur let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 3 chapters. He leaned back, his fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. He had spent months trying to finish Obscura Libri. It was supposed to be a simple tragedy about grief and the weight of history. But the characters, specifically the one he'd named after his own late grandmother, had started doing things he hadn't planned. The editor character? That hadn't been in his outline. That was his own self-doubt manifesting as a villain, trying to scrub the story clean because he didn't think it was good enough. They think I'm the one in control, Arthur whispered to the empty room. He reached for a physical notebook on his desk, the dark leather book that had served as the model for the one in the story. He opened it to the last page. The reality leak. As Arthur began to type the final movement of the sequel, the lights in his London apartment flickered. A scent began to waft through the room, cutting through the smell of coffee. Cinnamon. He frowned, looking toward his kitchen. Then he felt it, a dampness on his shoulder. He looked up. The ceiling of his apartment was perfectly dry, yet a single drop of cold, gray rain splashed onto his hand. It wasn't clear, it was a dark, viscous blue. Ink. Fear, cold and sharp, crawled up his spine. He looked back at his monitor. The text was scrolling on its own now. Elara, I can see you, Arthur. He froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He tried to hit the escape key, but the keys were stuck, as if they had been glued down with dried sap. Elara, you thought you were the one writing the sequel. But a story is a two-way mirror. You looked into our world for so long that you forgot to check if the door was locked on your side. Arthur scrambled back, his chair flipping over with a crash. On his desk, the leather-bound notebook began to hum. It vibrated with such intensity that the coffee mug rattled and fell, spilling dark liquid across his notes. The spill didn't behave like coffee. It began to shape itself into letters. It began to build a cityscape on his mahogany desk, tiny, liquid skyscrapers and a miniature M15 bus made of caffeine and shadow. The final convergence. The air in the room grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure dropping as if a storm were breaking inside the four walls of the study. The flickering monitor light turned a deep, obsidian black. A hand reached out from the screen. It wasn't a monstrous hand. It was small, with fingers stained by charcoal and ink. It was followed by a shoulder, then a head of tangled brown hair, and finally a wool scarf that looked damp from a December rain. Elara stepped out of the monitor and onto Arthur's desk. She was only 6 inches tall at first, a flickering holographic ghost of a girl, but as she stepped onto the physical wood of his world, she began to grow. She drew mass from the room, pulling the shadows from the corners, the ink from his pens, and the very air from his lungs. By the time she stood on the floor in front of him, she was life-sized. She looked exactly as he had imagined her, right down to the fraying hem of her coat. "You." Arthur gasped, clutching his throat. "You're not possible." "I'm as possible as the thoughts that made me," Elara said. Her voice was no longer a thought in his head, it was a physical vibration in the air. She walked over to the desk and picked up the fountain pen, the real one Arthur used to sign his contracts. In her hand, it looked identical to the scribe of the void she had wielded in the void. "My grandmother, your Evelyn, didn't die," Elara said softly, looking at the screen where the cursor still blinked. "She just moved to a different draft. And now, I'm moving to yours." Arthur backed into the wall, his eyes wide. "What are you going to do? Are you going to kill me? Delete me?" Elara looked at the pen, then back at him. She smiled, a smile that was both kind and terrifyingly sharp. "I'm a protagonist, Arthur. And a protagonist needs a setting." She pressed the nib of the pen against the wall of his apartment. She didn't write a word. She drew a line, a long, vertical slit that bled darkness. "The twist isn't that I'm real," she whispered, leaning in close to his ear. "The twist is that you were the first draft." The end of the line. Elara stepped through the slit in the wall, disappearing into a world that Arthur could no longer see. Arthur stood alone in his apartment. The silence was absolute. He turned back to his desk, desperate to write her back, to fix the ending, to regain control. But when he looked at his monitor, the screen was blank. When he looked at his notebook, the pages were white. He looked down at his own hands. They were beginning to lose their color. The tan of his skin, the blue of his veins, it was all fading into a flat, monochromatic gray. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was no longer a man, he was a sketch. He looked up one last time as the ceiling of his apartment began to dissolve, revealing not the sky, but a vast, wooden surface. A giant hand, infinitely larger than his entire world, reached down with a massive eraser. The end.